The government was scrambling today to deal with the fallout from the High Court's recent decision making indefinite immigration detention unlawful. 84 people have been released as a result of the ruling, all with no prospect of being deported, many with criminal records. The government has introduced legislation that imposes conditions, including mandatory ankle bracelets and curfews on those being released. Laura Tingle is our chief political correspondent. Laura, good evening.
Good evening, sir.
Now, that High Court decision that I've just referred to, it's a precedent almost 20 years old. Why did we get to this point today in Parliament?
Well, last week after the court made its finding but reserved its reasons, the government was saying, well, look, we have to wait to see what the reasons are before we can legislate, because we could run into fall foul of those reasons. But what happened, as I understand it, is that essentially the government wasn't all that surprised, or the department wasn't that surprised that the chap at the centre of the case would have to be released. But what they didn't take into account or caught them off guard was the fact that you'd see a whole group of people being released. The numbers once again climbed today to 84. That changed the politics of all of this, created an urgency which the coalition has been, ruthlessly pursuing politically over the last few days. They keep talking about these 80 plus hardened criminals, even though we don't actually know that they are all hardened criminals. We think they probably are, but we don't know exactly what they are. Yesterday they were still saying we can't act, and then by last night they said, we will be introducing legislation first thing in the morning. And then by question time today, they'd rolled over to further pressure from the coalition to make all of these conditions such as the ankle bracelets mandatory. So
just in terms of the dynamic in Parliament today, clearly we've had as you just described, it's an evolving story over a week. Did they lose control of the politics of it today?
Well, it certainly felt like that, Sarah. The government Labor is always very sensitive on these issues, and without a doubt, Peter Dutton's been completely relentless. He's linked it to the fact that the Prime Minister is overseas for the APEC meeting and is sort of basically suggesting he's, failing in his duty to people. The politics was absolutely savage. And it was interesting because having got the initial sort of rollover, if you like, or the appearance of a rollover of the government agreeing to bring legislation in today, it then went that step further. And the original legislation was saying, well, it is within the minister's capacity to impose these various conditions on particular people, and that might apply if they're sex offenders or whatever. But I think there is some concern that by essentially reversing that to say everybody must be subject to this indefinitely, but the minister has some scope to back away from it, it may raise questions about the constitutionality of the measures.
And just to understand the politics of it, because all of these people who are being or have been released, and there may be more who are released, as I understand it, where there are where people have been found guilty of crimes, they have completed those sentences. So like an ordinary member of the community who's completed a sentence, been to prison, got out, that's essentially what these people are, who also have an immigration issue. Is that right?
That's right. And if they were permanent citizens, they would basically come out, they would be subject to parole conditions, which would be applying to these people as well. But all of these extra things are being put on them. Now, one of the interesting things to me about this is that basically these people have all been prosecuted. The ones who have been prosecuted, not everybody within this complete cohort have been actually found guilty of crimes in Australia, but those who have been prosecuted here were prosecuted through the state system. It'll be the state and territory police who have to monitor them, run the parole system, the parole-like system. So we haven't heard much from the states about how it's going to work with them, but yes, it's creating this whole set of separate conditions which are onerous, including possibly not being able to work. How that sort of is functional indefinitely for all of these people is really hard to work out.
Now, just briefly, these were debates between the government and the opposition, but obviously the government's also got some issues with its own flank today. That's Catherine King's infrastructure review, which includes cutting infrastructure projects, had a very tough response from New South Wales, but particularly from Queensland.
Yes, well, I'm sure that's got nothing to do with the fact that Queensland's going to the election next year, Sarah, and that there's nothing like Canberra bashing at this stage. Essentially, the projects that are being cut are ones that actually have never started. Often they're ones that don't even have planning processes in place. The idea is that the government says it will spend the same $120 billion that it had already committed to, but we've seen these warnings from the IMF about the inflationary impact of the fact that there was this huge number of projects, not enough money to go around and not enough resources to put into them.
So how does this address that if they're not spending less money?
Because they're spending the same amount of money on less projects. So the pressure on resources to build all of these things will be less. I think the forecast in the report that Catherine King released today showed that in one particular year, I think 2027, the inflationary effect on the cost of those projects was going to be $10 billion extra in that year alone. So essentially they've cut that back. But I think the really interesting thing in a way beyond those projects that have been cut will be a couple of other changes that have been made in this, and most significantly that the federal government is saying any future projects will be done on a 50-50 basis, not 80-20, and of course the states will not like that at all.
Indeed. Laura Tingle, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Sarah.